Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video I want to talk about our favourite psychotic dictator, and that is President Putin of Russia. And I want to talk about him purely in a negotiation sense and what that means for the war in Ukraine. I'm not talking about the Ukraine war very much recently, so I thought I'd go back into that. Now there's lots of other people with far better analysis of the situation and so on than I have, but I'm going to come at this purely from the perspective of a negotiation, because at the end of the day, whatever Putin thinks he is doing, he is trying to achieve an outcome, and he considers himself to be politically savvy, a statesman of some worth, and this is widely seen as very much a big miscalculation on his part. So what I want to do is to look into that and talk about it in negotiation terms. Before I do that, I just want to highlight that this in no way belittles or trivializes the sacrifices being made by Ukraine specifically, but of course by all the people that are fighting and losing their lives in that. So don't take this as any kind of trivialization of those issues. This is literally just trying to focus on the objectives and aims from a purely negotiation perspective and using negotiation language. So for anyone new to this channel, I am the collaborative negotiator, professional negotiator with over 10 years of experience, and I like to use current events to highlight lessons that we can learn that negotiators will look at and will apply in their own negotiations when they are doing them. And of course, there are no bigger negotiations than those that happen on the world stage. Now, regulars on this channel will know that I always start by talking about objectives, and this is specifically true for any form of negotiation. No one goes into a negotiation for the sake of negotiating. They go in because they have an objective in mind. So when looking at this particular topic, I think let's have a quick focus on Putin's objectives, and let's rewind back to February. And we have to remember that there's a lot of misinformation out there, particularly from the Russian perspective. And this actually is not necessarily different in any negotiation. People may tell you what their objectives are, but the actions may tell you something different. And it's very important to recognize that. So ignoring all the guff about special military operations and denazifying Ukraine, it became very clear that Putin's objectives back in February of this year was that he wanted to take over the whole of Ukraine. And he wasn't going to do that in any sort of massive military operation and occupation, I should say, but rather he wanted to depose the government and install a puppet government that he could then control. So that was a clear objective that we can see from how the Russian military moved, how they tried to attack Kiev, and the things that they were doing. So in that context, Putin had some fairly specific objectives in mind, and in terms of what that would lead to as more, shall we say, his grand strategic objective, he would then use that control as leverage against the West. But don't forget, part of what triggers this is that Ukraine wanted to move toward the West. They wanted to be more aligned to European nations, to build economic and political ties westwards, not eastwards, towards Russia. And Putin did not want to lose that control. So by securing that control over Ukraine, in his mind, that would cement his control over the oil and gas supplies into Europe. That would also cement his control over the Black Sea, and that would allow him to use it as leverage against the West. He had more control over more territory, gives him more power, more assets, more industrial capacity, all the other bits and pieces. So that is, and in Putin's mind, this would have given him a stronger position to negotiate better deals with the Americans, with the Chinese, with the EU, and so on and so forth. Now there's a small little problem with this cunning plan. And again, regular viewers of the channel will be familiar with the next thing that I will talk about, which is for any negotiation, you should always understand what information you have and you don't have, and you need to do considerable preparation as part of the process of getting ready for the negotiation. Well, in this particular context, Putin's preparation was somewhat lacking, to put it mildly. And the information that he had available to him, that he used to set his objectives, was rather deficient in certain key areas. So, broadly speaking, those areas are: he completely underestimated Ukraine's capability to fight back. He hadn't realized how much the Ukrainian military has reorganized, how much weaponry that they had access to from the West, and also their willingness to fight back. He also completely underestimated the ability of the Russian military, and this could be a whole topic on itself about the lack of information, the corruption inherent in the Russian military, and so on. But short story is that he did not properly prepare his own forces, and he did not properly understand his own position and the ability of his people to carry out and secure the objectives that he wanted. And then, of course, the final bit of information that he massively got wrong was to just the extent to which the West would react to what he had done and properly support Ukraine. Now, admittedly, this is more leaning towards the first point of Ukraine's capabilities, because, of course, if Ukraine had not resisted as effectively as they had done, then the West may not have supported them so thoroughly as they have done. But either way, we can see from this that Putin wanted to enhance his negotiation position. He wanted to take over Ukraine, but his very poor preparation, his very deficient levels of knowledge about the things he did know and the things he didn't know have dramatically undermined his ability to control Ukraine as he had intended. So that is where we start in terms of Putin's negotiation objectives back in February. So having failed in his initial objectives, then Putin and the Russian state had to dramatically go to plan B. So they set up some new objectives and tried to pretend that was the objective all along. Bearing in mind, of course, that Putin's grand strategic objectives have not changed. He still wants to dictate terms to the West. He wants to control gas and oil. He wants to be politically influential. So he needs to find ways to achieve that, even though he has suddenly realized his deficiencies, that the Russian military are not as capable as he had assumed, that the Ukrainian military are more capable than he had assumed. So at which point he narrowed his scope and objectives down to control of the east and southern regions of Ukraine, so the Donbass, Donetsk region, and also all the way down on the south coast, very much to try and control all the way down to the port of Odessa. So now, it would be wrong to assume that Putin just wanted to control territory for the sake of controlling territory. That doesn't enhance his position in any significant way. So I don't think it is coincidental that what the new objectives were aiming for was not only to shift the border, shall we say, but also to be able to exert an economic stranglehold on the ability of the Ukrainian state to function. So by capturing important farmland, important potential oil areas in the eastern Ukraine, and by then completely dominating the whole of the coast and presumably securing control all the way up to the port of Odessa, That would have allowed Putin to have pretty much made Ukraine not economically viable. He would have been able to exert control over Ukraine, albeit not directly, but more indirectly, by controlling all the important things that Ukraine needed. So the ability to export grain, for example, to get money, the ability to drill for oil or gas or resources, the ability even to grow grain, perhaps. He would have controlled all of that. And even though he may have not been able to directly control the Ukrainian government, he would have been able to use his control of those critical areas as leverage to force them to readjust their reality and to, let's say, compromise. Compromise is perhaps too strong a word. More capitulate would have been more accurate. But in his mind, he would have forced them to capitulate to his demands, and he would have therefore gotten mostly what he wanted, even though he could not control the whole of Ukraine. Again, slight flaw in this cunning plan, and there are the same flaws basically as the first plan, which is he's still underestimating Ukraine's abilities. The Russians are still not capable of achieving even these revised objectives, and the West are continuing to expand their support to Ukraine even further. So again, even with this rescoping of his objectives, he is still not able to secure what he wants, and in fact the situation is getting worse as time goes on, because of course Ukraine are taking back lots of territory, and the more territory they take back, the less control he will be able to exert back on Ukraine in the future. And so now Putin needs to set himself yet more new objectives, and with this has come the realization that it's damage limitation, basically, at this point. Putin has now realized he is losing. He is not able to secure the control that he needs. He's not able to expand upon his gains. So the new strategy is basically just bomb Ukraine. Particularly Ukraine's power infrastructure is heading into winter. Now, I know a lot of the media commentary sort of tended to focus upon this as sort of an act of terrorism type thing. And I would caution a little bit against that, because while Putin clearly is a despotic psychopath that doesn't really care about people, he is not doing this for the sake of just being nasty to Ukrainian, albeit he doesn't mind doing that, of course. He is doing it because he is losing, and he knows he is losing. So the only way to claw back control for him is to make Ukraine stop. So now his objectives and his thought processes has shifted toward a process of trying to make the war so miserable for Ukraine that they will agree to a ceasefire. And this is what Putin now needs. This is his new objective. It's basically a ceasefire. He cannot publicly admit to this, but this is what he desperately needs. He needs Ukraine to want a ceasefire, to stop wanting to fight, so that he can cement his control or not lose any more territory to the Ukrainian military advances. So by bombing Ukraine's power supplies, he's very much going for the idea of making the cost too high for them to bear, on the basis that they will then sue for peace. And that pretty much reflects the lack of any other options that he has. He has tried to use mobilization. He has tried to use more weaponry. He has tried to enhance the ability of the Russians to fight. All of that has failed. So this is what he is down to, is using some of the few effective weapons he does have to actually try and target very specifically the infrastructure, with the very specific objectives of just trying to bring about that ceasefire as fast as possible. Now, yet again, he seems to have failed to understand Ukrainian resolve, their military capabilities, and the level of Western support that is being provided to Ukraine. We're spotting a bit of a pattern here, aren't we? So at this point, Russia, with Putin, has a slightly revised version of this plan, which is he needs to figure out how to turn the screws on the West. Now, he initially tried to do that by turning off the gas, particularly to Germany and to EU nations. Unfortunately for him, he had realised that the European willingness to take the pain and pay higher costs for gas and not take it from Putin invalidates this strategy. So he can't do it that way. So obviously he will know that European economy is going to be suffering. So he will be trying to do various things to make that suffering worse. And he failed to do that through gas and oil import. In fact, if anything, it's going the other way. People keep talking that Russian being fine. The Russian economy is absolutely not fine. It was largely dependent upon oil and gas supply, which was hugely dominated by Europe, and that is basically being turned off. It's not completely turned off at this point, but it will be come the new year. So at that point, the Russian economy is in big trouble. So Putin is trying to reflect that pain back onto Europe. And he's not been able to do that to oil and gas as he was originally intended. Indeed, that was his whole point, perhaps, for obtaining control of Ukraine, was to cement his control on those. So this is where we can see Russian tactics getting a little bit more underhand, looking at other oil and gas supplies into Europe, whether that comes from Norway, looking at telecoms infrastructure, looking at other things. And this is a very risky strategy for Putin. If he gets caught doing this, then he risks some severe escalation that even he is not necessarily going to be willing to be on the receiving end of. But he will be looking for any angle by which he can get European economies, or the West's economy, or the West's infrastructure to suffer even more. Because he had realised that Ukrainians hate him so much that no matter what he does, he probably will not be able to stop them fighting, even bombing all their power stations. So he now needs Ukraine's allies to exert pressure on his behalf for them to agree to that ceasefire. So that is his new objective, is to, by any means necessary, to get Ukraine to agree to a ceasefire. Whether he has diplomatic means, whether he tries coercion, underhand military means, whatever it may be, this is now Putin's new negotiation objective, to try and stop him losing any more Ukrainian territory. So unfortunately for Putin, the reality is that his position continues to weaken, and it does so on all fronts. His military continues to weaken. His perhaps domestic support, while still strong, is perhaps not as strong as it was. His political alliances are all weakening. They're not really willing to support him in this war. His economic position is not good, but is going to become really, really bad in a few months' time, as the Russian economy weakens significantly as a result of the sanctions. And so the longer that this war carries on, the less leverage he has, the less ability he has to force a ceasefire, as his ability to influence events just gets weaker and weaker across various different fronts. And the biggest problem he has at this point is that although he can recognise this, and although he's trying to adopt a policy of damage limitation, well, on him, obviously not on Ukraine, Ukraine simply are not in any mood to compromise. They're not willing to agree to him redrawing the borders where they currently are, wherever that may be. They're not willing for Russia to exert control over Ukrainian territory. And the situation is so bad that there's even open talk of Ukraine taking back Crimea, which would be a devastating political blow to Putin. So he's in this position that time is not on his side, but he's not able to call a halt to proceedings. And he's trying a whole variety of different things, but none of them are actually working. So what does he do? Well, something that I often talk about is that as in a negotiation, if you are in a weaker position, then you need to find ways of strengthening your position. And you can do that internally and externally. Putin has tried the internal route, mainly through the military, and mainly to try referendums and all that sort of thing. That has failed. So he now needs to go external. And he can either do that negatively or positively, I suppose. Negatively, of course, is what I spoke before, trying to get others to exert influence on Ukraine to make the pain stop, if you like, for them. But the other more positive way is to try and get other countries that will actively support him. And in this strategy, Putin has been surprisingly unsuccessful. Even the Chinese have been openly critical in certain respects. And sure, he can call upon Belarus and Syria to support him, but they are hardly major players in the world. And this is where we bump into the strange scenario of perhaps a little bit of alignment between Putin and Saudi Arabia. Now, Russia and Saudi Arabia have a shared interest in that they are both major oil and gas producers. And for them, there is a strategic interest in people wanting their oil and gas and for the prices to stay high. So in this context, Putin has found a small ally. Well, they don't have Saudi Arabia, not small on the world stage, but willing to help them at least in a small way and to keep oil prices high. So that at least buys Putin some sort of economic breathing space, as it were. He's still able to obtain revenue from his oil sales. But that does not change the situation on the ground in Ukraine of them being willing to agree a ceasefire. So this is the reality that he now finds himself, is that the war will continue to drag on and he will get weaker and weaker on several fronts as it does, unless some kind of external event or external nation is willing to come in and intervene in a dramatic way. And right now, I cannot see where that is going to come from. So what conclusions are worth drawing here? Well, I want to talk about a negotiation concept of the breakpoint, sometimes also referred to as the red lines, which is essentially in any negotiation, you realise you're not going to get what you want and you walk away. Now I'm going to make a bit of a dangerous prediction here, which is pretty much that the war is lost for Russia and for Putin. That is it. I think I called that several months ago, and I have had no reason to change my mind on that. So in any logical scenario, someone like Putin should take a hard, cold look at his position and go, this is not worth it, I need to walk away. So he should retrench all his troops back into Crimea and make sure that he can at least hold Crimea. Unfortunately, this is where emotions and ego and other such things get into the way. And this is very much true in negotiations. You will find that people will keep on going past the point where they should. They've gone past their red lines, they've gone past their break point, and yet for some reason they have not walked away. That is the position that Putin is in now. It is just too politically embarrassing for him to walk away. So unfortunately what that means, it doesn't change the outcome. The the war is still lost. But many more people will have to die before Putin is willing to admit to this fact. If he ever will get to a point of being willing to admit to the fact. This is the other thing he also has to realise, is that regardless of even if the war stopped tomorrow, the Russian economy is right down the toilet. If even the war stopped tomorrow, if even the whole West ceased all sanctions, the Russian economy is still buggered. That is the nature of what happened to an economy. There's a time lag to events happening and to the impact reverberating around the economy. So even though some people may talk about the Russian economy doing better than they anticipated, that is because many people have failed to actually understand what is happening. In previous videos, I've talked about three critical things for any economy to function. That is money, that is capital, stroke enablers, and that is labour. Where Russia's lost access to a lot of money, Russia has hugely lost access to capital, to technology, to enablers, things that it needs to be able to continue to function, never mind grow. And as a result of the war, and particularly the call to mobilization, Russia has lost an enormous amount of valuable labour, skilled labour in particular. That cannot be reversed overnight. So Russia's economy is on a significant downward spiral, and there is nothing anybody can do to stop that right now. But the longer the war goes on, the longer the sanctions are in place, the more that downward spiral will continue. Perhaps even it will get even steeper. So I'm pretty sure that somebody in Kremlin, if they're brave enough, will be telling Putin this, that he may still be politically dominant at this point in time, but come next year or 2 years' time, things are going to start to get truly desperate within the borders of Russia as a consequence of not stopping this war with Ukraine, which is why he so desperately needs them to be willing to agree to a ceasefire. So the question then becomes, what is he going to do? He is running out of leverage. He has tried shutting off the gas. He has tried bombing Ukraine power supply. He has tried exerting underhand pressure on Western economies. None of that is working. Certainly none of that is working at the pace that he needs it to work. So his ability to influence events are becoming more and more limited. So what is left to him? Now, people talk about escalation. They talk about nuclear weapons. But none of those are good options, even for Putin's warped little mind. He needs some kind of successful or damage limitation outcome. And right now, he had no means of achieving that without simply capitulating and accepting that Ukraine has beaten him. And until he is willing to reach that point, he is going to keep dragging this out, and he's going to keep looking for any angle that he can. Hopefully he won't get so desperate that he will do something truly, utterly stupid. But that is not a guarantee. I cannot make any assessment of his mental state. So the sort of conclusion I want to draw here is, don't go past the point of return in any kind of negotiation context. You have to know where you need to stop. And Putin did not prepare, did not think ahead, and therefore he doesn't know where to stop. He doesn't know where to pull back. And as a consequence of that, the pain that he and the country of Russia are going to feel are going to be that much worse. So I hope you found this video helpful. It's a slightly different look at the situation in Ukraine and Russia. And I should look forward to seeing the comments in the box below.